Mm. The night my mother-in-law stood in front of 200 people and called me a charity case, I was already holding the folder that would end her. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a Tuesday evening in March, 7 years ago, when I walked into the Caldwell family home for the first time and immediately understood that I would never belong there. The house was the kind that had a name, Thornfield Estate, actual engraved stone at the gate. I was 26 years old, wearing a dress I'd bought on clearance at Target, and my hands would not stop shaking. My boyfriend Daniel had warned me, in his gentle, apologetic way, that his mother was particular. That was the word he used. Particular. Her name was Margaret Caldwell. Everyone called her Mrs. Caldwell, even her own son in certain moods. She met us at the door before we'd even knocked. She looked at me the way you look at a receipt when the total is higher than expected. A slow scan, top to bottom. And then she smiled, the kind of smile that has no warmth anywhere inside it, and said, "So this is the social worker. Not you must be Claire. Not Daniel's told me so much about you. Just the job title." Spoken like a diagnosis. I worked for the Department of Child and Family Services. I had a master's degree. I had spent 4 years walking into homes that most people would never enter, sitting across from children whose eyes had gone quiet in ways that shouldn't be possible, writing reports that determined what happened next in their lives. I believed in the work completely. I still do. Margaret Caldwell believed I was a glorified babysitter for people who couldn't manage themselves. She never said that exactly. She was too careful for exact statements. But over the months that followed, she found 100 ways to say it without saying it. She asked Daniel, loudly enough for me to hear, whether I was doing something more with my career eventually. She introduced me at her garden club as the girl Daniel is seeing. She works with troubled children. She once asked me, with her head tilted and her voice full of performed concern, whether it was emotionally sustainable to do work like mine, or whether people in my field tended to burn out and need to be taken care of themselves. Daniel apologized every time. He was good at apologizing and bad at intervening. I loved him, and I was slowly learning the limits of what that meant. The first real rupture came the following Christmas. We were seated at the long dining table, 12 people, 3 kinds of wine, a centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment. Margaret's husband, Gerald, was there. Quiet, careful, a man who had learned decades ago to take up as little space as possible in his own home. Daniel's older sister, Vivian, was there with her husband, who worked in commercial real estate and talked about it constantly. And there was Margaret at the head of the table, orchestrating everything with the invisible authority of someone who had never once doubted that the room existed to accommodate her. She asked about my work. I should have known. She asked about it in front of everyone, which meant it wasn't really a question. I told her about a case I was proud of. Not details, I would never share details. But the shape of it, a situation where intervention had made a measurable difference, where a child who had been in a very dark place was now in a stable home doing well in school. I was careful. I was professional. I realize now, trying to make her see me. Margaret listened with that particular expression of hers, patient and faintly pained, like someone tolerating a long explanation of rules to a game they have no interest in playing. And then she said, "It sounds exhausting, doing damage control for other people's messes. Gerald's foundation does preventative work, of course. The idea is to address problems before they require intervention." She let the words sit there. Intervention. As if my entire career was a response to failure, rather than a form of care. "The foundation does wonderful things," Vivian said, nodding. "The gala raised nearly $800,000 last year." And just like that, the conversation moved on. As if I hadn't spoken at all, Gerald Caldwell's foundation was called the Caldwell Family Foundation for Community Advancement. It had been operating for 11 years. It awarded grants to nonprofits in the region, education initiatives, after-school programs, housing assistance organizations. It had a board, an executive director, a website with professional photography, and an annual gala at the Meridian Hotel that was, according to everyone who attended, the event of the season. What I knew about the foundation at that Christmas dinner was only what Daniel had told me, that it was Margaret's primary project, that she had essentially built it from Gerald's money and her own social connections, and that it was the source of most of her identity and all of her status. What I didn't know yet was what was happening inside it. Daniel proposed in June of that year. I said yes. I loved him, and I believed, perhaps naively, that marriage would change the geometry of things. That I would become family in a way that Margaret would have to honor. The engagement dinner was at Thornfield. Margaret cooked, or had her housekeeper cook, which is not the same thing but was presented as the same thing. She was gracious in a performative way, and for a few hours I thought maybe I had been wrong about her, or at least that she was capable of choosing kindness when it served her. Then, after dessert, when Daniel had gone to help Gerald with something in the other room, Margaret sat across from me with a glass of Bordeaux and said, very calmly, I want you to know that I think Daniel's happiness is the most important thing. Whatever that looks like. I want that too, I said. Of course. She swirled her glass. I do hope you've thought about what your contribution to this family will be. Financially, I mean. Daniel has a trajectory. The Caldwell name carries certain expectations. I'm sure you understand. I understood perfectly. She was telling me I wasn't enough, that my salary, my work, my whole life up to that point was insufficient for what her son deserved. She wasn't asking me to leave. She was more sophisticated than that. She was simply establishing, early and clearly, who held the measuring stick in this family and how I was expected to perform against it. I went home that night and sat in my apartment for a long time in the dark. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cry because somewhere underneath the hurt and the anger there was something quieter and more durable taking shape. Something patient. I thought about the children I'd worked with, the ones who'd learned that the loudest person in the room was not necessarily the most powerful, that real leverage is built slowly, invisibly, in ways that no one is watching. I thought about what Margaret valued: status, reputation, the foundation, the gala, the Caldwell name displayed on the side of a building, and I thought about my own career, and where it was going, and what I was quietly becoming. 3 months after the engagement dinner, I accepted a position at the State Office of Nonprofit Accountability. I didn't make an announcement. I told Daniel, who was happy for me and didn't fully understand the scope of what the role entailed. I didn't tell Margaret. She had never asked about my career in any way that suggested she actually wanted information, so I saw no reason to offer it. The Office of Nonprofit Accountability was a small division within the State Department of Finance. We had 12 staff members and an operating budget that would have seemed modest to someone like Margaret. What we had, in place of size, was authority. We were responsible for auditing nonprofits that received state grant funding, reviewing financial disclosures, investigating complaints, recommending organizations for continued funding, or flagging them for review, investigation, and, in some cases, the suspension of all state support. I was hired as a compliance analyst. Within 18 months, I was a senior analyst. Within 3 years, I was deputy director of compliance review. I was good at my job. I'd always been good at my job. I had always been good at looking at a situation and understanding the forces underneath the surface. It's the same skill that made me effective in child welfare work. You learn to read the gap between what people present and what is actually happening. Between the polished surface and the structure beneath. The Caldwell Family Foundation for Community Advancement received state grant funding. I discovered this 8 months into my new role while reviewing a quarterly disbursement report. The name appeared in a column of recipient organizations, unremarkable among dozens of others. A grant of $430,000 for a youth mentorship expansion initiative. I sat with that information for a while. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do. I did not open an investigation because of Margaret. I did not target the foundation. I recused myself formally from any direct review of the Caldwell Foundation and assigned it to a colleague, which is exactly what the protocol required. What I did do was my job, carefully and completely, everywhere else. I built a reputation for rigor. I made sure that when anything connected to the Caldwell Foundation eventually came across my desk through proper channels, the record would show that I had been nothing but correct in every direction. It took 14 months for the complaint to arrive. It came from a former program coordinator at a youth center that had partnered with the Caldwell Foundation on a mentorship initiative. Her name was Drea, and she had submitted a formal complaint to our office alleging financial mismanagement, specifically that a significant portion of grant funds designated for program materials and facility improvements had been redirected. That invoices had been filed for equipment and renovations that either didn't happen or happened at a fraction of the reported cost. That the foundation's executive director, a woman Margaret had hired personally, had approved expenditures with very limited board oversight. I assigned the case to 2 senior investigators. I attended the case review meetings as supervising deputy director, which was appropriate and routine. What those investigators found over the following 6 months was precise and well documented. Grant funds had been misused. The reported renovations at 3 partner facilities were inflated by a combined $212,000. Some of that money had been used to furnish the foundation's administrative offices, new furniture, a catering contract for board meetings, a technology upgrade that served no programmatic purpose. There was also a pattern of contracts awarded to vendors connected to board members without the competitive bidding process required under state guidelines. None of this appeared to involve Margaret directly in any transactional sense. She was not signing the fraudulent invoices, but she was the foundation's founder, its most prominent board member, and the person who had hired the executive director. She had signed off on annual reports that contained the misleading figures. In a civil accountability sense, her exposure was significant. We prepared our findings. The report recommended suspension of state funding pending a full financial audit, referral to the State Attorney General's office for further review, and formal notification to the IRS given the foundation's tax-exempt status. The night before I signed the final recommendation, Daniel asked me at dinner whether I was all right. I'd been quiet all week. Work stuff, I said, which was true. Anything you can talk about? He asked. Not yet, I said. Not yet, I said. Also true. He nodded and didn't push. That was something I'd always loved about him, the way he trusted me to hold things. The Caldwell Foundation's annual gala was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday in November. It was, I had been told every year, the event of the season. The Meridian Hotel. 200 guests. Cocktail hour, dinner, a live auction, remarks from Gerald and Margaret. Daniel and I had attended the previous 2 years, and each time I had watched Margaret in her element, radiant, commanding, the undisputed center of a room she had built, and I had felt the particular loneliness of being invisible to the person you are supposed to matter to. This year, I was invited as usual. Margaret extended the invitation to Daniel in early October, before any of what was coming had become public. I accepted. Our compliance report was finalized and submitted to the relevant authorities on October 28th. Per protocol, the foundation would receive formal written notification. The Attorney General's office would make its own determinations about timing. The IRS review would proceed on its own timeline. None of that was in my hands by the time the gala arrived. The night of the event, I wore a dress I bought specifically for the occasion, not clearance this time, not performing anything, just what I wanted to wear. Daniel looked at me in the hallway of our apartment and said, "You look beautiful," in a way that meant he meant it. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Ready," I said. He gave me a look, a slight tilt of his head, something careful in his eyes. But he only offered me his arm. The Meridian Ballroom was everything it always was. The kind of room that announces money before you fully entered it. Chandeliers, rounds of 10, flower arrangements so tall they required their own structural logic. There was a cocktail reception first, and I moved through it the way I had learned to move through rooms like this. Not performing comfort I didn't feel, but not surrendering to discomfort either. I shook hands and made conversation and ate one small crab cake that was genuinely excellent. Margaret found us near the bar. She was wearing deep emerald, her hair professionally done, a strand of pearls that I had seen in the Caldwell family portrait hanging in the study at Thornfield. She kissed Daniel's cheek. She looked at me with a version of warmth that had always been slightly more formal than warmth actually is, and said, "Claire, so glad you could make it," in the tone of someone marking attendance. Dinner was served. The food was excellent, because Margaret did not permit anything to be less than excellent in a room she controlled. Gerald spoke first, brief, warm, a little nervous in the way he always was in crowds. He thanked the donors, named a few initiatives, introduced the foundation's new partner program at a community college. Then Margaret took the podium. She was, I will say this honestly, a remarkable public speaker, assured, specific in her praise. She had a gift for making the people in the room feel that their presence was both necessary and personally appreciated. She talked about the foundation's history, about Gerald's original vision, about the youth the foundation had served. She named numbers, she cited outcomes, and then she decided to introduce her family. It was something she had done before, a moment near the end of remarks where she acknowledged the people who supported her. Vivienne and her husband, Gerald, and Daniel with his wife. Except this year she paused. She looked at me across the room with something deliberate in her expression. A pause that lasted just a beat too long, and she said, "My daughter-in-law Claire is here tonight as well. Claire works for the state, some kind of review office, I believe. Forms and compliance. Very important to have people to manage paperwork." A few polite laughs. Nothing mean, just the reflex sound of a crowd responding to a performance. She moved on immediately, but the shape of it sat in the air. My career reduced to paperwork. My years of training and work collapsed into a bureaucratic function, offered up as a small joke for 200 people in formal wear. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table. I felt the particular stillness that I have learned to recognize in myself, not blankness, but the opposite of blankness. Full attention, clarity. I stood up. Daniel's hand tightened slightly. I squeezed it once, reassuringly, and then I walked to the front of the room. Margaret was stepping back from the podium. She saw me coming, and her expression did something complicated. Surprise, then recalibration, then a smile that was reaching for grace. "Actually," I said, stopping beside the podium, "if you don't mind, I'd love to say a few words." The room had that particular quality of held breath that I recognized from certain meetings, everyone aware that something was shifting, no one certain yet in which direction. Margaret hesitated 1 second too long, and because she was in a room full of donors and partners and people she needed to impress, and because saying no would itself be a statement, she gestured toward the podium and stepped aside. I looked out at the room. "Thank you," I said. "I'll be quick, I promise. Margaret is right that I work in state compliance. Specifically, I'm Deputy Director of the Office of Nonprofit Accountability. My team reviews how state grant funds are used by organizations across the sector. We look at financial disclosures, program outcomes, vendor relationships. We do this because public funding carries public responsibility, and the people it's meant to serve deserve to know it's being used correctly." I paused. The room was very quiet now. The Caldwell Family Foundation has done real good in this community. I want to say that clearly, and I want that on the record. The youth who have participated in foundation programs have benefited. That is true, and it matters. Another pause. I had learned this in 100 difficult conversations. That silence, used intentionally, is not awkwardness. It is weight. It is also true that my office finalized a compliance review of this foundation 2 weeks ago. That review identified significant concerns regarding the use of state grant funds. Our findings have been submitted to the appropriate authorities, including the State Attorney General and the IRS. The foundation has been formally notified, and state funding is currently suspended, pending the outcome of those reviews. The room did not erupt. It went the other direction. A deep, compressing quiet, the sound of 200 people processing something they had not come here to receive. I did not look at Margaret. I looked at the room. I'm telling you this here, tonight, not to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because many of you in this room are donors. Some of you are partner organizations. You have a right to know the status of an organization you've supported. The review process is ongoing, and everyone is entitled to due process. But transparency is not optional when public funds are involved. I stepped back from the podium. "Thank you for a lovely dinner," I said. "The crab cakes were genuinely wonderful." I walked back to my seat. The silence lasted another few seconds. Then the room began to exhale in small conversational clusters, the way a crowd does when it's trying to process something by talking around it. Daniel was looking at me. His expression was not angry. It was something else, recognition, maybe. The look of someone finally seeing a shape they had been sensing for a long time. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "About the findings." 2 weeks. "About the findings' exposure?" "Longer. And you didn't tell me." I couldn't. Ethically. I recused from direct review, and I held the line. Everything I did was by protocol. I looked at him carefully. "I need you to believe that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." Margaret did not come to our table. I watched her at the periphery of my vision, surrounded by people, her expression composed and rigid, the performance still running, but running on reserve. Gerald had his hand on her back. He looked, not for the first time, like a man who had long ago made peace with knowing less than he thought he knew. We left before the live auction. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean after the warmth of the ballroom. Daniel and I walked to the car without speaking. In the parking garage, under the fluorescent lights, he stopped and turned to face me. "She was never going to see you," he said. It wasn't a question. "No. I let that go on too long. You were in a hard position. That's not the same as it being okay." He looked at the ground, then back at me. "I'm sorry, Claire." I took his hand. I held it for a moment. "I didn't do this for an apology," I said. "I did my job. The same job I've always done. I look at a situation and I try to understand what's actually happening, and then I do what the situation requires." I paused. "She called it paperwork." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "What happens now?" he asked. "To her, to the foundation." "That's not in my hands. The Attorney General's office will make their determination. The IRS will do the same. The foundation may be able to address the compliance issues and continue operating in some form, or it may not. That depends on what the full audit finds and what the legal review concludes. She'll blame you. She already blames me. She decided what I was 7 years ago in a doorway. This doesn't change that. We drove home mostly in quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't emptiness but accommodation. Two people making room for something large and complicated that doesn't need to be resolved tonight. The formal investigation took 8 months. The Caldwell Foundation's executive director resigned within the first 30 days. The Attorney General's review resulted in a civil settlement. The foundation agreed to repay a portion of the misused funds, implement new governance procedures, and operate under a consent agreement for 2 years. No criminal charges were filed. Margaret was not personally named in the settlement, though she issued a public statement accepting organizational responsibility and announcing she was stepping back from the foundation's board. The statement did not mention my name. She would not have been capable of that. I heard through Daniel that she told Vivienne the whole thing had been politically motivated, that someone with a grudge had abused a government position to target her family. I understood why she needed that story. A narrative where she is the target of an agenda is more survivable than a narrative where she is simply accountable. I don't carry anger about it. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important. I'm not telling this story because I want you to be angry on my behalf, though I understand if you are. I'm telling it because of something I understood in those 7 years of waiting, working, and being quietly dismissed. The people who reduce you, who flatten your work into a punchline, who introduce you as a job title, spoken like a diminishment, who look at the shape of your life and see only what it lacks. Those people are counting on your silence. They're counting on the fact that you will absorb it and continue presenting yourself for their approval. That the hierarchy they'd built inside their own head is the hierarchy you'll accept. Margaret counted on my silence for 7 years. She was not wrong that I was silent. She was wrong about what the silence meant. There is a kind of patience that isn't passivity. It's the patience of someone who understands that real accountability doesn't come from a confrontation in a kitchen or a tearful phone call or a letter that gets read once and put in a drawer. Real accountability comes from doing your work so well for so long with such consistency that when the moment arrives, and it always arrives, eventually, you have earned the standing to speak. And what you say cannot be dismissed as emotion or grievance. It can only be the record. Margaret introduced me as someone who manages paperwork. She was not entirely wrong. I do work with paperwork. Invoices, disbursement reports, financial disclosures filed under penalty of law, grant agreements specifying how public money must be used, and what happens when it isn't. I'm very good with paperwork. The foundation's donor list shrank significantly after the gala. Some partners paused their relationships. Others quietly redirected their giving. The annual event did not take place the following year. Gerald retired fully from public life, which seemed to bring him something close to relief. Daniel and I are still married. He is, it turns out, a person who is capable of growth when the circumstances make avoiding growth impossible. That matters to me. We have had hard conversations that were necessary and honest. We are still having them. His mother and I do not have a relationship. We are civil when the calendar requires proximity. That is enough. What I have is this: the work. The cases still coming through my office. The organizations doing their jobs correctly with nothing to fear from our review. The ones that aren't, who are now aware that the paperwork finds everything. A young analyst joined my team last spring. Smart, meticulous, The kind of person who reads footnotes. On her second week, she came to my office with a question about a discrepancy she'd spotted in a filing that 2 more senior reviewers had missed. I looked at it with her. She was right. How did you catch it? I asked. She shrugged. I just kept reading. Most people stop before the footnotes. I thought about a doorway 7 years ago. A woman's eyes moving over me, taking inventory of everything I wasn't. Good, I said. Never stop before the footnotes. That's where everything real is buried. She nodded and went back to her desk. I sat for a moment in the quiet of my office. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary rhythms. Indifferent, ongoing, full of structures that look stable from the outside until someone reads far enough to find the fault lines. I turned back to my screen. There was work to do.